Ohioans go to the grocery store, they're paying for corporate stock buybacks and executive bonuses. Prices today are far too high. Families are having a hard time finding a fair price, seeing more of their paycheck vanish into thin air. I hear all the time from Ohioans justifiably angry that when they buy groceries and other basic essentials, they're paying more than they did a few years ago. All of this happens while corporate profits hit record highs. Let's be clear, the fact that prices and corporate profits are going up at the same time is no coincidence. Study for the Kansas City Fed found that corporate profits drove half the price increases in 2021, and profits are still high today. Of course, I want businesses to make money. I want American companies to be the most competitive and most profitable in the world. What I am against is corporate profiteering that funnels money from working people to executives in the form of massive bonuses and stock buybacks. I'm against markets that don't foster competition and low prices. I'm against market manipulation. A family walking into a restaurant or a store should not have to guess what they'll be charged. Someone shopping online should not be paying more for the exact same product because of their online search history. Businesses should create new goods and services that Americans want to buy at prices justified by the cost. And workers, critical for the success of businesses, of course, should be paid fairly for helping the businesses succeed. Instead, the same Wall Street business model that has kept wages low and executive compensation sky high for decades is now pushing prices up too. Corporations use supply shocks from the pandemic and the war in Ukraine as an excuse to raise prices, and they keep raising them. Be clear, they're not charging more because they're paying workers more. Wages are not causing price hikes. Corporations are raising prices far beyond their input costs and funneling those profits to executives, not workers, just like they always do. They've realized when the market isn't free or fair, they can push prices up higher and higher. And they're using tried and true technologies, new technology to refine old ones to charge those higher and higher prices and get away with it. When they're talking to their Wall Street investors, they admit what they're doing. On an investor earnings call, one CEO of a major American company said, consumers are tolerating frequent price increases well. You hear that, consumers are tolerating price increases. I'm here to tell CEOs that working families cannot tolerate unfair price increases. Price gouging isn't new, but it's getting easier and easier to conceal. By now, we've heard what the media dubbed shrinkflation, where corporations shrink their products but keep the prices the same or even raise them. The rolls of toilet paper have fewer sheets, but they didn't lower the price. The package of Oreos has fewer cookies in it, but the price stays the same. The trick isn't new, but it's getting worse. What's next? Will they shrink the amount of cream in the Oreo cookies? Will double stuffed become half stuffed? Companies use advances in technology to find new methods of price gouging. They're now using new pricing strategies and data collection to charge more. They call these tactics dynamic pricing and personalized pricing algorithms. Dynamic pricing, personalized pricing. You know, some corporate PR firm is really proud of those terms. Customers don't want their pricing personalized. They want it to be fair. They want it to be transparent. They want it to be as low as possible. Gone are the days when Americans simply could walk into a store having a clear idea of what they were about to pay. It's not just the act of walking into a brick and mortar store that's nostalgic. It's the notion of predictable, transparent prices. With online retailers, the price can change every day or even within the hour, sometimes dramatically. They spread the technique to brick and mortar stores, adding electronic menu boards to restaurants and digital price labels to shelves so the corporation can raise the price at a moment's notice. It's frustrating. It makes it impossible for people to compare prices and shop around. Key ingredients in any fair, open market. Families with fixed budgets can't afford to walk into the grocery store, into a pharmacy, not knowing how far their paycheck will get them. Big tech has exported their data mining business model to retailers, and that has made all of this even easier for companies. As more people shop online, retailers learn more about browsing and shopping habits all of us have by collecting every bit of our online data. They can charge you more based on your search history. You start shopping around to try to find the lowest price on a new washing machine. Online retailers realize you're in the market for appliances, start showing you higher and higher prices, spying on people, charging them more for the products they need. It's not innovation, it's price gouging. Charging more for food during mealtime isn't free market, it's exploitation. The story's all the same, always the same. Whether you use old tricks or new technologies, corporations win, the rest of us typically lose. That's not how free markets are supposed to work. It's why standing up to corporate interests matter. And why it matters. And people hate Washington. People hate Washington because too many politicians in this town over and over and over do corporations' bidding. Took us more than a decade of fighting the drug companies and their lobbyists and their allies in Congress to finally lower drug prices and to cap the cost of insulin at $35 a month for seniors. Almost nothing we've done elicits the kind of reception that I get when I talk about lowering the price, capping the price of insulin at $35. Yet look how hard it was in this country because so many of my colleagues were doing the bidding of corporate interests, doing the bidding of big pharma, day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year. But consumers had a victory when we capped the price of insulin at $35. We need members of Congress to grow spines and stand up to more of these corporate lobbyists. Senator Casey and I have a bill to crack down on companies shrinking their products and raising their prices by directing the FTC to label this what it really is, and that is a deceptive practice. We need our colleagues to join us in efforts like this to lower prices, to stop these tactics that distort the market and stifle competition and make it harder for Americans to afford the cost of living. Ranking Member Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here with us this morning. Listening to our chairman, Democrats would have Americans believe that the economic pain they're feeling is caused by greedy corporations putting a few less chips in your chip bag. It couldn't be more clear where the obvious pain is coming from. The obvious pain is coming from a guy who lives at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. The bottom line is that President Biden and Bidenomics has devastated our economy and devastated people working paycheck to paycheck. The highest percentage of Americans with the fewest dollars in their savings account for an emergency is now because of President Biden and Democrats' reckless spending. They like to name their bills in attractive ways, but the bottom line is a very simple thing. They all add to inflation, whether it's the American Rescue Plan, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, or the worst named bill perhaps in American history, the Inflation Reduction Act. Anyone who believes that inflation has gone down because of the Inflation Reduction Act, all you have to do is look at the latest information coming out of the Federal Reserve itself. Inflation continues to increase. These bills used to be hailed positively as a part of Bidenomics, but now they're just economics because no one can afford President Biden's approach to solving the problems that we see in our nation. And I know this to be true because it doesn't matter whether I'm at home in South Carolina or any other state around the country, I keep hearing the same things from consumers. Rent is too high. I'll never be able to afford a mortgage. I'm living paycheck to paycheck. My grocery bills are staggering and I can barely afford them. Or I spent my entire life working and building up enough savings just to retire. But now I'm worried that those savings won't go far enough and I'll have to go back to work. Or I'm really worried about my finances and our economy. And they always end with a simple question: what can you do to help me? The number one concern, besides the devastation that Americans are experiencing because of an unsafe, insecure, wide-open southern border, the number one concern outside of that border is the economy. And Americans across the country point their fingers at the devastation of inflation. Inflation today is costing the average American family an additional $8,508 just to buy the same things they were able to buy before President Biden took office. It is truly unfortunate that the Biden administration continues to play a game of deflection, not taking responsibility, not solving the problem, but looking for someone else to blame other than the man in the mirror. First, the Biden administration told us that the challenges that we were seeing with inflation was transitory. I cannot tell you the number of hearings I sat through, whether it was Secretary Yellen or others, who said that this is transitory because of COVID. Well, then they changed the story that it was Putin's price hike because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Then it was greedflation or shrinkflation. The fact of the matter is simply Biden's inflation. Here's the truth. The Biden administration's spending policies has caused the inflation that we're seeing and the economic devastation it is producing. They are the key contributors to the price hikes we are all experiencing today. Let's take a step back to understand what inflation really feels like to the average American. Prices across the board have certainly increased nearly 20% since Biden took office. Yes, 20% increase in just over 3 years. For example, butter's up 27%, chicken 26%, white bread 30%. When you go to the pump, you don't have to believe what President Biden says about the challenges. All you have to do is see the price at the pump, 40% increase. Energy costs, 25% increase. I could spend the rest of my time this morning discussing other examples of how much prices have increased. But the American people know all too well that the challenges that they face and where it comes. That's why they trust him so little on the economy. It is crystal clear. They know what they see with their own eyes. Yet, instead of looking at ways we can bring inflation down, this administration continues to look for scapegoats, such as corporate America. But here's what the Federal Reserve recently studied. The Federal Reserve studied the administration's claims that corporations are driving up inflation and came to the conclusion, and I'll just read it, unprecedented large and direct government intervention and accommodative monetary policy. Profits were back to their pre-pandemic levels by the end of 2022. With respect to shrinkflation, the Biden administration's own BLS, Bureau of Labor Statistics, reported that its effects have resulted in a 0.01% average annual increase to prices and has a very small impact on the overall inflation picture. I know this is really uncomfortable for some of you to listen to it, but that's just called the facts. What we should be talking about today is the direct harm this administration's policies are causing as they continue to lead to more inflation. We should be talking about the inflation spike we are likely to see after billions and billions of dollars in student loans are illegally forgiven by this administration. We should be talking about a federal debt that is growing by trillions of dollars every single year. The American people are smart. They see through this blatant attempt by this administration to blame others for the inevitable results of their policies. It's time for the Biden administration and their friends on the other side of the aisle to wake up, smell the coffee that now costs 30% more. Out of control, reckless spending led to runaway inflation that has remained elevated for years now. We must all accept the fact and return to sound economic policies that make affording the basics just a bit easier for the American family. With that, I yield back and look forward to asking some questions.
Thank you, Senator Scott. Welcome the three witnesses to the committee. Mr. Bilal Baidoun is the Director of Policy and Research at Groundwork Collaborative. Mr. Baidoun has served as a senior advisor in several government organizations, including the city of Dearborn, Michigan. He holds a Master of Public Policy from the University of Michigan. Dr. Allison Schrager is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute. She's an economist, contributing editor at City Journal, co-founder of Life Cycle Finance Partners. Dr. Schrager is an undergraduate degree from the University of Edinburgh and a PhD in economics from Columbia University. Dr. Schrager, welcome. Mr. Ali Bustamante is the Director of Worker Power and Economic Security Program at the Roosevelt Institute. Dr. Bustamante is an expert on labor economics and public policy. Prior to joining Roosevelt, he served as chief economist at the Louisiana Workforce Commission. He received his BA and PhD from the University of Miami. Dr. Bustamante, welcome. Mr. Baidoon, please begin.
Thank you, Senator. Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Scott, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Bilal Baidoon. I'm the Director of Policy and Research at the Groundwork Collaborative, an economic think tank based here in Washington. The modern price tag was invented by John Wanamaker of Philadelphia, a devout Presbyterian who believed that if we were equal before God, we ought to be equal before price. And so from the very beginning, the price tag was infused with a sense of fairness and equality. Yet in America today, a fair price, let alone a sweet deal, is harder and harder to come by. In the age of corporate concentration and high-powered algorithms, pricing is in the midst of a troubling transformation, and the price tag as we know it may become a relic of the past. Rideshare apps like Uber have reportedly charged users higher prices if their phone battery was lower. Insurance companies fly drones above our property in search of signs of clutter, and car companies install software that reports our driving behavior to insurance companies, who use the data to hike our rates. Amazon reportedly changes prices millions of times per day while running secret price hiking experiments like Project Nessie that reaped $1 billion in revenue. Frustratingly, food delivery apps like Uber Eats show us one menu price up front, only to tack on mysterious junk fees right at checkout. In a practice known as shrinkflation, companies discreetly reduce the size or volume of common household items, everything from jars of peanut butter to bars of soap, to charge consumers more for less. All of these tactics converge on a single goal: find out the maximum price that individual consumers are willing to pay. In competitive markets, companies often have to innovate, outwork the competition, and improve products and services in order to keep customers happy. But a perfect storm in our economy made it much easier for companies to simply price their way to record profits. First, companies have gotten bigger. About 3/4 of domestic industries have become more concentrated and are dominated by fewer players than they were 20 years ago. This grants the remaining large firms the freedom to hike prices without fear of being undercut by the competition. Second, pricing has gone high-tech. Technological advances such as cloud computing, AI, and surveillance targeting have enabled companies to collect reams of personal information on consumers and change prices in under a nanosecond. These technologies help companies build profiles of individual customers that include things like our age, marital status, estimated salary, ethnicity, the magazines we read, and even the type of topics we discuss online. Finally, market power and technological advances came together in the shadow of inflation, giving companies the cover to roll out pricing strategies once thought to be too risky, precisely because consumers dislike them. But with prices rising everywhere, customers couldn't distinguish which hikes were due to rising costs and which were truly excessive. As a Barclays executive told Bloomberg in 2022, quote, "The longer inflation lasts and the more widespread it is, the more air cover it gives companies to raise prices," unquote. The complex algorithms entrusted with setting prices to maximize revenues have neither a conscience nor legal training, which is why algorithmic pricing can be both discriminatory and collusive. But we don't have to accept the end of a fair price as inevitable. We must continue to enforce current laws that outlaw collusion and unfair and deceptive practices, while also recognizing that algorithms can fix prices just as well as human agents can. But new laws are also necessary. The Price Gouging Prevention Act, introduced in this chamber, would enable the Federal Trade Commission to enforce a federal anti-price gouging statute. Likewise, the Shrinkflation Prevention Act would classify shrinkflation as a deceptive practice and empower the FTC to take civil action on behalf of consumers. We must also continue to eliminate junk fees and regulate complex pricing structures that push hidden fees on consumers. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau's late fees rule demonstrates that policymakers can and must protect consumers from predatory fees. By capping late fees at $8, the CFPB will save American families more than $10 billion annually. Finally, we can't allow companies to harvest our data and use it to price discriminate against us. Protecting data privacy, including transactions data, is essential to confronting this new pricing regime and ensuring companies cannot surveil consumers while pushing arbitrary price hikes. There's no doubt we have the tools to restore a fair price in America. We just have to use them. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Madoon. Dr. Schrager.
Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Scott, and members of the committee, thank you for the invitation today. I'm a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, where I research fiscal and monetary policy and financial markets. I'm also a columnist at Bloomberg Opinion. And the high inflation environment we're in is a terrible economic burden for American households, especially those living paycheck to paycheck who are struggling to afford groceries, let alone enjoy the occasional meal out with their family. And it's tempting to blame whoever raised the price we see, the firms we buy goods and services from, who appear to be getting rich off of our bills. But they are not at fault. They are merely reacting to the realities of the high, uncertain inflation environment we are all facing. In order to bring inflation down, we need to understand it, how it started, and why it persists. History has shown that misdiagnosing the problem and then implementing misguided policies will only create more harm for American households. And my testimony explains how we got here and why inflation remains high. But the main reason it's remaining high is we're still in an elevated, high-demand environment, and that is made worse by stimulative fiscal policy. Inflation, though, cannot be blamed on greedy corporations. First, there's no reason to think that corporations have just suddenly become greedy. It is natural to increase prices when you're facing a period of high demand. Take the example of an umbrella salesman in the rain. It does feel really unfair that he increases his price when it rains, but if he didn't increase prices when it starts to sprinkle, there'll be no umbrellas left when there is a downpour. Or if he can't make more money in the rain, why would he bother sitting in the rain himself and sell umbrellas? We see a similar story playing out in markets today. Prices are increasing because demand is still high. We see consumer spending is still up. We see a rather very tight and vigorous labor market, and GDP, particularly around demand focusing, are still growing. And prices do rise when demand is high, and this price adjustment is how markets ration goods. It is true that there was an increase in profits in 2021 when inflation first spiked, but profits peaked in 2021 and have since fallen and leveled off. One way to understand what happened is that initially, firms raised prices in response to increased demand and the limited supply coming out of the pandemic. But just like that umbrella salesman, they increased price and reduced that higher demand. Now, at first, the cost of their inputs did not go up as much, in part because firms had existing contracts. But as time went on, they had to renegotiate those contracts and gave many of their employees raises. And then profit margins declined. So in addition to just increasing prices, firms might instead just shrink the volume of the product they sell, but keep prices the same. This is shrinkflation. It's like fewer potato chips in a bag. But this is just another way for firms to increase prices. And again, I see why this is extremely frustrating to customers. They are getting less and paying more. But it is really just another way to pass along high price increase of the sort of overall high demand environment we have and rising input costs. You know, whether or not increasing prices or increasing the volume of the good is better, it really is sort of hard to say. But it's important to understand that sometimes just charging more reduces sort of more people from buying the good altogether. Now, dynamic pricing is another way that you can increase prices, and this is just increasing prices for consumers, not others, and particularly consumers who are more willing and able to pay more. Wendy's recently attempted this when they floated the idea of charging more during peak times. But an example of dynamic pricing that predates Wendy's is airlines. We've been living with their dynamic pricing for years. They charge more during peak times, or they are now charging more for goods that used to be included in the price, like a check bag or picking your seat. Now, this is, again, consumers hate this because it feels unfair, but it's important to understand that this actually is how airlines also deal with the pricing pressure from technology that enables consumers to look at goods, to use the internet to sort of price comparison shop, which puts pricing pressure on airlines. And the result is that the cost of flying has gone down. In the 1980s, only 30% of Americans had flown in the last year. Now it is more like 50%. In large part because lower-income Americans do have a cheaper option, even if it means worse service. And the same is true for Wendy's. If they just increases prices across the board, then fewer people would be able to go to Wendy's. And we can expect more of this. And in fact, the research shows that a lot of the same technology that enables price discrimination has also created a more inclusive market and had some deflationary pressure on prices before the pandemic. So I understand why this high pricing environment is causing frustration for consumers. It causes frustration for me too. But this is, again, the result of the high demand environment we're in, and that is largely made worse by sort of stimulative fiscal policies that's still piling on. I'm adding fuel to the fire to this high demand environment. Past attempts from companies if we choose the wrong solutions, such as price controls, those have proven counterproductive in the past. They create shortages, they reduce incentives to sell and produce, and they can worsen inflation. The best way to fix this is not to undermine the Fed's attempts to control inflation, pull back on spending, stop handouts, especially to high earners who don't need them, and try to reduce the debt.
Thank you, Ms. Schrager. Dr. Bustamante, welcome.
Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Scott, and honorable members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to speak on the pressing issues surrounding how corporate pricing strategies are impacting prices and their implications for consumer finances. In my testimony, I will make 3 points. 1, inflation is being driven in part by corporate profiteering related to firms' price-setting power. 2, corporate profiteering is harming consumers, workers, and small businesses. And 3, government has tools that can restrict corporate profiteering and protect consumers and small businesses. First, there is evidence that large corporations are engaging in pricing strategies that are contributing to elevated prices. Research conducted by my colleagues and I at the Roosevelt Institute has found that a recent sharp rise in markups by large corporations is contributing to inflation. Markups are the difference between the prices consumers pay for goods or services and how much it costs to make or provide them. Markups are low in competitive markets, but as corporations have accumulated significant market power over the years, they have been able to increase prices without sacrificing profit. Our research finds average markups grew from 48% above cost in 2014 to 69% above cost in 2023, and that is growth that is being driven by a few large corporations. For consumers, markups can take several forms through various pricing strategies employed by corporations. Standard retail markup, this is the most straightforward markup where sellers add a percentage to the cost of goods and services to generate profit. Shrinkflation, reducing the quantity or size of a product while maintaining or increasing its price. Dynamic pricing, a method of price discrimination whereby prices adjust in real time using pricing algorithms and sophisticated consumer data, often with new artificial intelligence methods. Decoy pricing, pricing structures where firms introduce a third, less attractive option to lead consumers to choose a more expensive option than they originally might have. Bundling products together to sell them at a price that seems to offer a savings compared to buying each item individually, but that often includes a markup. Markups and the sophisticated pricing strategies that are driving them are on the rise because of large corporations' outsized market power. Research finds that smaller firms in less consolidated industries have not driven explosive markup growth. Take the fast food industry, for example. My recent research of markups finds that the average markup in the fast food industry grew by 14.7% during the past decade. When analyzing markups at the 10 largest fast food firms in 2023, we found that they were the highest at Wendy's, McDonald's, and Restaurant Brands International, the parent company of Burger King and Popeyes. At these firms, prices were between 80 and 91% above companies' marginal costs. These large companies are charging consumers above and beyond what is necessary for typical profit margins. Second, there is ample evidence that markups and corporate profiteering in general by large corporations are harming consumers, workers, and small businesses. Consumer surplus, how economists measure the socioeconomic benefits of consumption, would have been 14% higher in 2019 if markups had remained stable at 2006 levels, and 50% higher if firms passed along the reductions in their costs over that period to consumers. This hits low-income consumers the hardest, as their disposable income is stretched even thinner, forcing them to make difficult decisions about the basic necessities and bills they need to cover. Workers are also being squeezed. Research shows that increases in markups lead to a decline in wages of approximately 12% because markups lead to a reduction in the aggregate demand for labor. The harmful effect of markups on workers is also visible in the declining share of income going to workers. Rather than rewarding workers who drive productivity in the first place, these large corporations driving growth in markups are the same ones returning higher profits from markups to wealthy shareholders via stock buybacks and dividends. Furthermore, markups reflect a winner-take-most economic environment where large corporations with price-setting power also have the capability to reduce competition by creating barriers to new firms to enter the market, crowd out smaller firms, and squeeze supplier margins in order to protect and expand their market share. Lastly, I'd like to discuss the myriad of available government tools that can restrict corporate profiteering and protect consumers, workers, and small businesses. We need to enforce and strengthen antitrust laws to prevent monopolistic practices and ensure competitive markets, particularly in industries where a few companies control significant market share, leading to higher markups. Policymakers can move to create guidelines and restrictions around the use of dynamic and personalized pricing to prevent unfair and deceptive practices by requiring businesses to fully disclose the pricing structure of their products and services. This would disincentivize corporations from enjoying these predatory pricing practices. To improve fairness and transparency in pricing, administrative agencies like the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau can mandate clear disclosure of pricing components and service fees and enforce rules against deceptive pricing practices or hidden fees. This is particularly impactful in sectors prone to higher markups, such as financial services and healthcare. There are great economic benefits to be gained by reining in markups and unfair corporate pricing strategies, including lower prices in the short term and more competitive economic environment for business and workers in the medium and long term. Yet inaction from both regulators and legislators will enable corporate profiteering that continues to elevate prices, harm consumers, and squeeze small businesses. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bustamante. The question will give Senator Tester of Montana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the courtesy, and I want to thank you and the ranking member for holding this very important hearing. And I appreciate the folks who gave their testimony. I want to start with you, Dr. Bustamante. I believe in capitalism. I think you got to have competition in the marketplace, keeps everybody honest. I think what we've seen in many, many different sectors of our economy is way too much consolidation. I want to bring agriculture up as one. You know the statistics. 3/4 of the global grain market is controlled by 4 traders. 82% of the U.S. beef market is controlled by 4 packers. I'm going to tell you, and I'm a farmer in my real life, that concentration prevents folks that are in production agriculture, family farmers, from being able to survive. And by the statistics, by the way, the statistics on the other end point that out. 85% of farm income is going to 7% of the farms. 93% of the farms in Montana, for example, share just 15% of the farm income. That's a system that, quite frankly, needs some attention. We're talking about consumers getting taken advantage of. We talk about producers of the food, in this case, getting taken advantage of. Can you tell me if, and excuse me if I'm stepping out, but can you tell me if things like the Packers and Stockyards Act that was passed over 100 years ago, because the industry of meatpacking was so consolidated, and today is even more consolidated than it was 100 years ago, is something that we should really focus on, or is it a different issue than just making sure that people are following the antitrust laws that are out there?
Consolidation has been a huge issue driving markups and higher market concentration in so many industries, as you mentioned. When we think of meat and meat processing, the fact that cattle ranchers used to get about 67% of every dollar that consumers were paying was actually going to them. Now it's closer to 33%. And this is a huge red flag that meat packers are basically driving consumer prices, but actually not passing on those gains to cattle ranchers or to workers to begin with. Yeah. And so it's really being able to push back against consolidation, being able to push back against these large corporations that ultimately have so much market share that they're able to squeeze suppliers, consumers, and workers at the same time.
Well, thank you for that, because you're spot on. And I will tell you, food security is really, really important in this country. And because you're just not enforcing the laws that have been on the books for 100 years, we're forcing more consolidation at the ground level. And I've said this, and I mean this: if we lose family farm agriculture in this country becomes far, far, far less secure. And so I think Congress needs to pay attention to that. And in that vein, I would tell you that Chairwoman Stabenow put out her farm bill yesterday, and in that she included a bill that I've been pushing for and that I've sponsored, Meat and Poultry Special Investigator Act. This is for you, Mr. Badoon. You mentioned the negative impacts of consolidation, of reduced competition, however you want to put it in your testimony. Could you flesh out a little more what increased competition and accountability, how that could help farmers, ranchers, consumers, and what Congress needs to do from your perspective to try to make this happen?
Absolutely, Senator. Thanks for the question. In competitive markets, we know that prices come down in part because firms have to compete against one another to win over consumer loyalty. And the consolidation we've seen over the last 20 years especially has created such a situation where pricing has been divorced from competition. And so whereas once pricing was a fairly straightforward process that took into account factors such as the cost of materials, labor, the lack of competition, and also the advent of algorithms in which all sorts of industries, including beef processing, for example, use algorithms, all share the same algorithm, and that effectively allows these companies to collude and higher prices. Now, those higher prices are at the all across the supply chain, and ultimately consumers feel that at the checkout line.
Well, I just appreciate this hearing because I firmly believe if you're worried about how many ounces are in a potato chip bag or a Fritos or a Oreo cookie bag, competition can fix that problem, but Congress has to do their job. Thank you guys very much.
Senator Scott of South Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here this morning. Since taking office, the Biden administration has been on a regulatory blitz. And what I mean by that is if you compare it to the Obama administration, where you saw about $300 billion of increased costs resulting from more regulations, under the Biden administration, we've seen about a 1.3, almost a $1.4 trillion increase in the regulatory burden put on businesses. Having been in business, started a few businesses myself, that could only increase the cost of being in business. You compare that with the total cost of the Trump administration, that was a little bit over $30 billion. So $30 billion with the Trump administration, $300 billion with the Obama administration, and over 1.3, nearly $1.4 trillion of added regulatory cost. Dr. Schrager, do you agree that the breakneck speed of new regulations finalized by this administration has contributed to inflation?
Yeah, it certainly has contributed. As I said, there's a lot of factors going on, but certainly when you make it more expensive for businesses to produce, spend more time on paperwork, especially a huge part of inflation that consumers are having problems with is the cost of housing. And certainly a lot of regulation, and particularly a lot of environmental regulations that make it more expensive to build housing is making that more expensive. And I think we're seeing in a lot of surveys that, as I said, the cost of housing is really number one for a lot of consumers. So I think deregulation it wouldn't solve all of the inflation problems, but it would certainly help.
Let me just stay on that subject because I hadn't thought about what you just said as it relates to housing. Certainly seen the housing costs go up without question. I served some time in local government where we improved and increased the building requirements in Charleston County. If you think about the regulatory burden that comes from a municipality or a county, and then you add that on top of the state, and on top of that is the federal government, you see this regulatory burden that is, in many ways for small businesses, frankly oppressive. I also think that an oppressive regulatory environment actually reduces competition and only benefits the players who are already in that space, and is more likely to create a monopoly in that space. That is not good for consumers. Thoughts?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And in fact, we see this a lot in Europe, who have a lot more regulatory burden, particularly around technology, which we're talking about here, and how firms use data. And this was intended, as I said, to increase competition, but actually had the opposite effect, because complying with all of these regulations have actually made technological entrepreneurship much harder there.
There's no doubt when you see our largest technological firms saying, please regulate me, because it closes the door of competition, it kind of answers the question itself. A different question for you. I won't say this very well, but I'll do my best. From my perspective, watching the legislation leave Washington and impact the country, whether it's the first bill signed into law, the $1.9 trillion legislation, that artificial stimulation where you're pouring new resources or cash into our economy, actually artificial stimulation called government from the money from the government, increases the demand without increasing the supply. And so if you increase the demand without increasing the supply, and you add on top of that the snarl from a transportation perspective that we saw in 21 and 22, it's harder to get your supplies. So it only increases the demand because you have fewer supply and you have more money in the market, which also increases the supply. The ultimate outcome of that is less supply, larger demand, and no real ability to see when your products are going to get there. That is very hard for businesses to manage, and it only leads to a more challenging environment.
Yeah, exactly. I think even economists who associate themselves as Democrats would have been saying that at least 3 to 4 percentage points of the initial inflation was due to stimulative fiscal policy, which is definitely sort of added to demand. And, it's important to argue we still have very stimulative fiscal policy, despite the fact we're in a high inflation environment, which makes the Fed's job a lot harder.
Great. I only have about 20 seconds left. You said, I think, during your opening comments that the corporate profits peaked in 2021? 22. I think that's actually relevant as well as we think about the greed of our corporations. And frankly, I'm not going to sit here and defend any of them, but they have the ability and responsibility of defending themselves. But as a kid who grew up in poverty, the one thing I can tell you is that the price that we're seeing at the pump and the lack of the ability for a single mother to navigate gas prices, energy prices, and food prices, when we see a glut of resources coming into the marketplace, and for 52 consecutive paychecks, inflation outpaces her wage increases. That's a devastation. That's not a problem, but a crisis.
Thanks, Senator Scott. This question is to both of you, to Mr. Baden and to Dr. Bustamante. Ohioans are angry, as we all know, as they are all over the country, about the rising cost of everything. Every time they go to the grocery store, families pay for corporate stock buybacks, pay for executive bonuses. As prices increase, so do profits. Corporate profits climbed to record highs at the end of 2023, are projected to keep climbing through 2024. Dr. Bustamante, how much are corporate profits in their quest to drive them higher and higher? How much does that contribute to rising prices today?
Thank you for that question, Senator. When we look at data from the San Francisco Federal Reserve, we actually find that more than 2/3 of inflation is actually being driven by supply factors and other factors that are not demand related. And in fact, when we look at corporate profiteering and we're looking at markups, that's largely accounting for about 16% of inflation that we're actually seeing over the past 6 months.
Mr. Biden, what do you think about that?
Our own analysis, Senator, at Groundwork has found that in the second and third quarters of 2023, corporate profits drove over half of inflation, about 53% of inflation. Just as a point of comparison, over the last 40 years before the pandemic, profits drove just 11% of inflation. And I think what's interesting over this period is that although consumer prices have risen, the price of inputs has gone down, and also the labor share of income has gone down. And so there's still plenty more of savings to pass on to consumers, but there's also plenty more to share with workers.
And what you said tracks with a report that I cited earlier on the Kansas City Fed. Mr. Biden, you spoke about higher profits are contributing to higher prices. We've seen companies now raise prices, as you know, and shrink their products while charging people the same price or even raising the price. This means people are either buying less of the things they need or paying more or both. A study found that so-called shrinkflation accounts for about 10% of the price increases consumers experienced. Consumers really don't know how much their money is getting them. Could you provide other examples of how corporations use so-called shrinkflation to make it harder for consumers to find the lowest price?
Absolutely, Senator. I think Americans would really be stunned to see the breadth of how many different strategies there are. It really runs the gamut from lowering the number of paper towels that come in a roll, the number of Kleenex that are in a box. It could be increasing the indentation of a drink so that it's, so that less liquid could go inside. It could be discreetly reducing the amount of dish soap in the bottle, and so really there's all sorts of creative ways. I would also add that in addition to shrinkflation, there's also a practice known as skimpflation, which involves degrading the quality of those products while keeping the price the same. And so we're now seeing a new frontier of ways to deceive consumers into paying higher prices.
So talk about, if you would, talk about technology. What kind of ways it's easier for corporations to charge higher prices, keep consumers in the dark? And can we have free market competition if customers cannot compare prices and can't really shop around for lower prices?
Absolutely, Senator. Pricing, as I said, was a fairly simple formula. It took into account the cost of materials, the cost of labor, and some rudimentary analysis about what your competition was up to. And companies would simply stick that final price of that calculation on a price tag, and they would let it be. But today, we are in a totally different era. Technology really enables companies to, number one, surveil consumers and collect data about consumers that, frankly, only our families and God should know about. Things like marital status, ethnicity. And so all of those things are really fed into algorithms that are able to test each one of our sensitivity to price hikes. And the goal is always the same. It's let's find out the maximum price that each individual consumer is willing to pay.
Dr. Bustamante, your thoughts on that?
Yes, thank you, Senator. What we ultimately know is that when we look at these pricing strategies, they're very much black boxes that corporations are ultimately employing. And that really opens the door for potential discriminatory practices, for practices that ultimately harm families that are already on the brink of having so much financial stress in their lives.
Thank you. I wanted to mention next week, in the next hearing, we're going to talk about junk fees. And we know that the complexities of technology and the comments you each made about the employment of these technologies by companies that produce these products make fees even harder to ascertain and understand. CFPB just released a report that found that consumers pay more with complex pricing structures. The committee next week will hold a hearing examining how junk fees hurt consumers and how we can ensure consumers can keep more of their own money. Senator Tillis of North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Baidoon, so if someone making a business decision to charge a price that they believe is over a general market value that reduces the number of people that can purchase it, do you think that's a bad practice?
Senator, I think if companies engage in practices that are unfair, deceptive.
Well, no, I'm back to that specific use case. I am a business person knowingly making a decision to price above to reduce the number of people that can afford a product that I've decided to sell. You think that that's fundamentally a bad decision?
Not necessarily, Senator, but we do have the concept of price gouging still applies. And if companies are raising prices to protect their profit margins from rising costs, that's one consideration. But if they're hiking their prices to reap super normal profits, that's a problem.
In your opening statement, I think you may have mentioned that you believe corporate profit margins are abnormally high. Do you agree with that? That they're abnormally high? Because it seems to be in conflict with the Fed report of September 2023, where they said when you adjust for COVID, some of the COVID policies implemented, that they were more or less back to pre-pandemic levels. So do you disagree with the Fed's assessment?
Senator, over the last 3 years, corporate profit margins have hovered around 70-year highs.
So you disagree with the Fed's assessment in their September 23 report?
I'm not familiar with that specific
It'd be
passage,
interesting
but
for the record in that context if you disagree, because it seems to be in conflict. I'm just curious. Ms. Schrader, and thank you, Mr. Baidoon, for the skimpflation. That's a new one I can add to my lexicon. But let's use Frito-Lay as an example. Look, they're making a bit. I was using that example. You answered the question differently, but a homeowner who decides to price a house above the market is making that decision at an atomic level. I'm glad you actually did not say that that was a bad thing, because we can't create a free market sort of concept for small businesses and not a free market concept for big businesses, because those big businesses were once small. And I think it's very dangerous when we decide that perhaps we should have some oversight to determine what an adequate profit margin is for, let's say, a Frito-Lay. I don't know if you're probably too young to remember it, but Frito-Lay had a catastrophic failure with fat-free potato chips. You remember those, Mr. Chair, Olestra, that ended up not doing very well. Businesses don't always succeed. Sometimes businesses lose money. And so we only seem to talk about this when businesses are succeeding, when businesses aren't going into bankruptcy. I, for one, think that the internet's doing a pretty good job of identifying when potato chip bags are getting smaller. I, for one, am very cheap. So I'll go find a brand that I like that hadn't skimped on me or hadn't shrunk on me. I don't know why the free market's not going to take care of this, but you did bring up something that's critically important that I happen to agree with. It's actually the only thing I agree with, to be honest with you, based on your opening testimony, and that is the use of consumer data. This is where we're failing. We just had a hearing, Mr. Chair, in Finance yesterday. A couple of years ago, when Europe implemented GDPR, Congress was hot to say, we've got to get controls over data. People should have to explicitly opt in to having their data shared, knowingly marketing it, et cetera. Everybody was hot on it, and then all of a sudden we found out there were 2 or 3 committees involved. We wasted 2 or 3 years, and we haven't done a damn thing. As a matter of fact, we've implemented a patchwork, states have, that are actually making it more costly. So now these, to some people here, bad corporations are actually incurring more costs because they're having to adhere to a patchwork of data privacy rules at the state level because Congress has failed to act. I actually believe if we want to reduce prices, then we have to go back to what Ranking Member Scott referred to. We can't just say it's just corporate greed. We have to look at the last 3 or 4 years of added regulatory burdens, of a lack of really trying to work on trade agreement, all these things that actually affect global competition and ultimately price points. But on that issue, because it was brought up in finance, on data privacy, data ownership, data breach, boy, I hope we can get that under control, because if we do, it will fix some of the stuff that you're talking about. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator, thank you, Senator Hill. Senator Warren of Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And if we're going to talk about markets and how perfect markets are, maybe the one thing we should talk about is how concentrated markets have become. And when we have concentrated markets, we have a whole lot less competition. So just a handful of companies have taken over the food industry thanks to literally hundreds of mergers over the last 50 years. Just 4 grocery chains control an average of 72% of sales in American cities. And in most grocery categories like bread, pasta, beef, cereal, just 4 companies control more than 60% of the market. Now, less competition means food brands don't have to compete on either price or product quality. For families' pocketbooks, that means higher prices. Grocery prices have climbed faster than inflation over the past few years. Now families are paying 25% more than they did before the pandemic. So I want to talk today about the tricks and traps that families face when they head to the grocery store. Mr. Bustamante, you have researched corporate pricing practices. I understand that when inflation increases, food producers and grocery stores may need to pass on some of those higher costs to customers. But the question is, have groceries gotten more expensive just because of inflation, that is, passing along higher prices, or is there more going on here?
Thank you, Senator. What we actually see is that if you look at the long-term price, the actual marginal cost of production for many groceries have actually gone down. And part of the big reason for this is actually with just the nature of the supply chains that have actually been developed over time. That being said, those lower marginal costs were not passed on to consumers. Instead, what we see is that for the past 40 years, this just growing and fastening trajectory of markups, basically, again, firms pricing their products and services at a much higher rate than the actual increase in costs. And when we see them during the past few years, that's just been accelerated due to the pandemic.
Right. And something they can do because there's a lot of concentration in the industry, so there's not much competition. In fact, corporate profits rose 5 times faster than inflation between 2020 and 2022. Kraft Heinz, which sells everything from Oreos to pasta sauce to coffee, increased profits by 448% over 2022. Cal-Maine, the largest egg producer in the U.S., increased profits by 718%. In fact, for most of 2023, corporate profits drove over half of inflation. Now, that hasn't stopped Big Food from pulling out another trick. Jacking up prices was not enough, so food companies have decided to quietly shrink the size of products, lobbing off a few inches here, a few chips there, a few cookies somewhere else. This shrinkflation is all about deceiving customers so that corporations can pad their profits. The CEO of the snack company Oots admitted calling shrinkflation the path to higher margins. So it seems like we've lost the basic principle of knowing how much something costs before we pay for it. Mr. Beydoun, you have been studying corporate behavior for years. Have you seen, in your research, have you seen a shift in behavior here?
I have, Senator. Companies deploy a vast array of tactics that really threaten to make the price tag as we know it totally obsolete. I'll just name a few. In addition to shrinkflation, there's also skimpflation. This is the idea of degrading the quality of a product by using inferior ingredients while keeping the price the same or higher. There's also dynamic pricing. This involves changing the price of a product hundreds, thousands, even millions of times in a day or week, making it difficult to predict costs. And finally, there's a practice known as drip pricing. This involves adding on mysterious, confusing fees as consumers are making a purchase, as opposed to building all of those fees into the upfront cost.
Okay, so you've got a lot of tricks and traps you identify. I understand it not only happens when you pull something off the shelf, it also happens when families get to the cash register, when they get ready to check out. Mr. Beydoun, let's say you've picked out all of your groceries, cashier rings them up or you ring them up yourself, and you use your credit card to pay. Can you talk to us a little bit about the opportunities that big credit card companies have to squeeze consumers on their groceries?
Absolutely, Senator. In many ways, customers get gouged once at the checkout line, and in many ways they get gouged again if they carry that balance on a credit card, not only through exorbitant APRs, but also through junk fees like late fees. Up until recently, credit card issuers could charge as high as $41 for missing a payment, but thankfully the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau actually capped those fees at $8, and that's something that'll save 45 million Americans an average of $220 a year, $15 billion annually in total. And so those are the sorts of interventions we need.
And special thanks to the Biden administration that has really started attacking these junk fees. Congress also needs to step up. We need to pass Senator Casey's Shrinkflation Prevention Act to end shrinkflation, and my Price Gouging Prevention Act to give the FTC the tools it needs. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Haggerty of Tennessee is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'm wondering why we're having this meeting today. I've been, very surprised by the fact that we're going through some type of blame-shifting exercise where we know what the real cause of inflation is here in America. And the cause of inflation in America right now over the past 3.5 years has to do with policies that have been implemented by the Biden administration and by Democrat legislation that was passed without a single Republican vote. The American Rescue Plan, as it was called, the Inflation Reduction Act, as it was called, dumping trillions of dollars into the economy, stimulating demand way beyond what the economy could encounter. You jack up demand, and at the same time, imposing massive regulatory constraints that suppress supply. It's obvious what's going to happen. Prices go up. The American family, the American consumer can't withstand this. Prices are up 19% since Joe Biden took office. Young families can't afford a new home right now. The American public is suffering dramatically. Yet here we are in a blame-shifting exercise trying to argue about how many potato chips are in a bag of potato chips. Look, the American public can see right through this. Whether we pay the same price for fewer potato chips or pay more for the equivalent number of potato chips, inflation is real. And inflation is the product of policies that have been implemented that are damaging the American economy. You think about the blatant vote buying that the Biden administration has undertaken with student loan forgiveness. Again, billions of dollars more into the economy, putting it on the backs of hardworking Americans to pay off doctors and lawyers and people with graduate degrees. The American public can see through this. The American public is suffering. We've got bank failures. We've got serious issues that this committee should be addressing. Yet here we are today talking about some sloganeering exercise called shrinkflation. This is not what we should be considering, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Haggard. I guess you weren't here when we talked about that same bill when we limited the cost of insulin to $35 a month. Senator Smith of Minnesota.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a question I'm going to bring to you, Mr. Bustamante, in a minute, but I want to just follow up on what Senator Haggerty was asking about. He seems to be suggesting that government spending is what is contributing to rising prices that consumers are experiencing at the grocery store when they buy auto insurance. So do you think the child tax credit was contributing to inflation?
Thank you for the question, Senator. When we actually look at whether it's at 2022, whether it's looking at 2023, or even during the past 6 months, about 2/3 of inflation is actually due to supply factors as well as other factors unrelated to demand.
Right, right. So our investment in the child tax credit, in housing assistance, and student loan forgiveness is not what's causing prices to go up for consumers. And I actually think what I hear from my constituents in Minnesota is they're trying to figure out, like, why is it that I'm paying so much more at the same time that corporate profits are going up so much? I just had this question today, Mr. Chair, when I had my coffee with Tina, with Minnesota constituents, and one of my constituents was trying to understand why his insurance, his home insurance rates were going up so much. Now, let me ask you about this. I want to actually hone in on auto insurance, which has been emerging as a huge driver in rising prices. In Minnesota, car insurance rates have gone up 35%, more than 35% between 2022 and 2023. Now, some of that, of course, can be attributed to rising costs of car parts and other market forces, but there's also been a real reduction in coverage options and fewer choices for consumers, and consumers are getting squeezed here. So can you talk about this a little bit? What are you seeing when it comes to rising car insurance rates, and to what do you attribute these increased costs? And let's be honest, another sector where there's a fair amount of concentration, as Senator Warren was discussing.
Thank you, Senator. Yes, you're actually pointing at two main factors that are driving inflation in higher prices in the insurance industry, which is a key driver to inflation today. One is consolidation. There are just fewer insurance providers out there, and that has enabled them to collude and ultimately pass price hikes much greater than the actual cost to replace parts or replace cars. And then the second factor, which has been this black box of pricing strategies that insurance companies ultimately employ, which enable them to both engage in economic discrimination, where they're able to offer very similar customers vastly different prices just based on their personal characteristics, oftentimes in ways that are not transparent, in ways that are ultimately driving prices much higher than they ought to be.
Competition and the free market works when there's good balance, when there's a shared power, so that consumers have power, businesses have power, and then allows consumers choice, and therefore they're able to make the best choice and not be sort of constrained by only having one or two places where they can purchase something. And speaking of black boxes, Mr. Beydoun, I want to come to you next. We're seeing this huge affordability crisis in housing and in rents. I see this in my home state of Minnesota. And one of the things that I'm particularly concerned about is how algorithmic pricing is being used to allow ways for landlords to be able to use their market power to raise rents in ways that are just patently unfair. Could you talk about this? I'm particularly concerned about RealPage, a company that has reportedly used confidential data and algorithms to help landlords indirectly collude to set prices and even withhold supply in the market.
That's right, Senator. And if a group of landlords controls most of the units in a neighborhood, and they all use the same algorithm to suggest prices, that algorithm can effectively drive up prices and facilitate collusion in the same way that a human could. And so if these landlords were getting together at a barbecue and deciding to raise prices, they could come to the same sort of level of price hikes. The algorithm could come to the same level of price hikes that humans can.
That's right. And I mean, that kind of collusion to raise prices across an industry sector is, I mean, we don't allow that, right?
No, it's illegal. And
Right.
And that's why I'm certainly applaud the Federal Trade Commission for applying antitrust law to these more modern scenarios and very effectively making the point that algorithms can facilitate collusion.
Yeah, I agree with that. RealPage is now the subject of multiple investigations and lawsuits, and I wonder how long it will take before the next iteration of this strategy comes about and where we go from here. Do you have any advice for us? I appreciate you calling out the FTC, which I think have been doing an excellent job, but other advice for us as we look at ways to put some guardrails around how this technology can lead to collusion?
Absolutely. I would also call out junk fees in rental. I think that's something that's a new frontier, and increasingly the cost of rent, the upfront cost that renters are seeing, is not the final cost they pay. And I think this body and other regulatory agencies really need to protect the basic guarantee that the price we see is the price we'll pay.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Senator Smith. Senator Brett from Alabama is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate all of you being here with us today. I will be the first one to say that I think we can all agree that any practices of deceptive price gouging or intentionally misleading of consumers or elsewhere are completely and totally unacceptable. But we already have laws in place to prevent and enforce against that. What we're here to discuss today is a separate matter. The fact is that businesses, just like families in Alabama and in Ohio, Mr. Chairman, all across our country are having to rethink and adjust their spending patterns to adapt to the current economic circumstances. Circumstances that are driven by persistent high inflation that we've experienced over the last 3 years. Those circumstances have wreaked havoc on businesses, especially the local Main Street establishments that make up the economic heartbeat of their communities and our nation. Core material costs have risen since 2021, and overhead costs in things like utilities and, as you just mentioned, rent and interest have also gone up significantly. Plus, packaging costs for products are up 40%, and domestic shipping costs are up over 20% since 2021. Businesses of all sizes are having to make changes in response to those increased costs just to stay afloat and serve their customers. However, rather than focusing on the root of the problem, I am again discouraged by the apparent lack of responsibility taken by the White House for the consequences of their own actions. Instead of changing policies, this administration has chosen to change its messaging. It's engaged in an absurd attempt to blame shift rather than to reverse course or to admit any fault. Across the board, Americans' finances are being decimated from this administration's policies. 78% of Americans reported having to live paycheck to paycheck in 2023, up 6% from the previous year. We've seen Americans' credit card debt surpass $1 trillion, the highest amount in history. We've seen families that have witnessed mortgage rates double, putting American dream of home ownership, which we know is something that so many people strive for, out of reach. Let me just read you a few data points upon the recent March 2024 Consumer Price Index report that came out. Compared to January 2021, the average Alabama household is paying $918 more per month to purchase the same basket of food and services. Spending is up $133 more per month when it comes to actually going to get something to eat. Spending is up $162 more on shelter, and spending is up $249 more a month on transportation. I want to emphasize this. Cumulatively, the average Alabama household has spent $20,297 more due to inflation since January of 2021. The biggest issue impacting consumers today is not that they have less Fritos in the bag. It's that they have less money in their pocket. You mentioned, Mrs. Schrager, in your testimony, you said, quote, "History has shown that misguided diagnosis of a problem and then implementing this misguided policy will actually create more harm for American households." I fully agree with you. During the pandemic, we saw the Federal Reserve purchase trillions of dollars in Treasury securities, to which initially contributed to inflation. But by the pandemic, while it's long over, as you mentioned, monetary policy has become more restrictive. White House officials then routinely mischaracterized the high inflationary environment as transitory, spurring the administration to pass unprecedented levels of spending when the economy simply wasn't ready. Mrs. Schrager, in your testimony, you also refer to a, quote, "loose fiscal policy." And with continued spending and government subsidies towards things like clean energy programs and so-called loan forgiveness. Can you please discuss how this type of loose policy only worsens inflation?
Yeah, so it does a couple different ways. First of all, we're just adding to demand. I mean, as you can see as well, we also have a very tight labor market, and a lot of these policies are scoped to be job creating. So we're just adding even more competition to the labor market, which raises wages, which is also going to raise prices. And as I said, it's just putting more money in the economy, more money in people's pockets. But I think also there's more economic research and sort of a burgeoning consensus that just increasing the debt also increases inflation, because and people anticipate that, eventually this debt will have to be paid off, higher interest rates, and that also will increase inflation.
Absolutely. We have about 72% of our spending is mandatory spending, and that continues to grow. And the debt at $34.5 trillion is just simply unacceptable. It's not only fiscally irresponsible, in my opinion, it is morally irresponsible. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Senator Brett. Apparently, there's a couple people that are going to come back, but I'm not sure they are. So prior to closing, I thank you all, first of all. I always learn something at these hearings, in addition to the substance that each of you offered and the questions, the way you answered questions. I learned another thing, and that is the different kinds of Fed studies there can be. Senator Scott mentioned what's called a Fed's note. It's not a report like the report I mentioned from the Kansas City Fed. It's one economist putting something out as a Fed's note, but really written by one economist. So you don't have to plumb very deeply to find a lot of different conflicting voices and almost a cacophony. I've never had trouble saying that word, cacophony, of voices and ideas. So it's pretty clear that that what the Fed said, what the Boston Fed said about market consolidation, what the Kansas City Fed said about the contribution to inflation from corporate profits are important, and I will just ask unanimous consent to put the Kansas City Fed study in the record. Thanks for the witnesses today for your testimony. Senators who wish to submit questions for their hearing record, those questions are due 1 week from today. My colleagues, May 9th. To the witnesses, each of the three of you, please submit your responses to questions for the record. No more than 45 days from the day you receive them. Thanks for being here. The committee is adjourned.